Howdy folks. From groundbreaking innovations to emerging trends, I'll aim to be your guide decoding the complexities and simplifying the jargon. Whether you're completely new to the cloud and FinOps, starting on your journey, or simply curious about the future of technology, this is the video for you. This week, I'm going to cover FinOps news for February. This is something new I'm trying out just to try and get folks from a non-technical background aware of what's going on within the FinOps and cloud space as it's ever evolving. So if you have any interviews, if you're talking about this internally with your IT teams, you have an idea of what's the latest and greatest that they're facing in terms of challenges because it's changing all of the time. What I've done is I'm standing on the shoulders of giants with this stuff. So I'm going to try and kind of build up from the granular all the way to a higher level view of the piece. So I'm going to start with FinOps Foundation. So they have a monthly summit. I'll give you my view on what was discussed and some of the material there. Then there's a podcast I listen to monthly called What's New in Cloud FinOps, where the guys there, they do a summary of some of the release notes and any new um, stuff that the cloud providers are releasing that have impact FinOps. So that's the next level up again. And then third, I look at the Cloudcast, which is another podcast I listen to, which releases a month cloud news of the month. This again is a higher level again for cloud and the wider tech industry. So I'll give a flavor for what was discussed there. And then finally, it's bonus bits. So that's anything I've kind of seen or heard with the last month that might be relevant to anyone listening. So without further ado, FinOps Summit was held on February 22nd. The main output and thing that was discussed on this one was the State of FinOps 2024 survey results. Which screen am I on? This one. So the headline figure was what are your top priority as a FinOps practitioner. So there was over 1,000 people responded surveyed. There was an average cloud spend there of about 44 million. Obviously, there's a wide spectrum there in terms of the amount of cloud spend that each person is looking at. So it can vary a lot, but 44 million was the middle. The data does allow you to drill in for different sizes of industries and cloud environments. So that is quite useful if you are wondering what are the challenges that a business of your size is potentially facing, that FinOps practitioners are facing, that you might be able to address. The main highlight from this was that the top priority has shifted to reducing waste and managing commitments. So reducing waste is usage optimization. Managing commitments is rate optimization, which are two key pillars of FinOps, and they're two of the pillars that I suppose as a finance person moving into FinOps that you can impact most, especially around the managing commitments piece. You don't need that technical knowledge to be able to go after that particular element. A lot of this shift often reflects the macroeconomic environment that's out there. So cost of living, interest rates are high for businesses. So for them to get additional funding, it's costing them 5, 6, 7%. Whereas if they can shave a bit off their cloud bill, maximizing their ROI, they can just take the money from there and reinvest it in the business where it's required. So there's a real tightening of the purse strings, and it's as if the accountants are getting a bit more control. This is reflected even further, I think, by the fact that previously empowering engineers to take action was the top priority for the last 3 years before that. So the survey started in 2021. So 21, 22, 23, empowering engineers to take action, top of the pops. In terms of the FinOps person speaking to engineers, could you right size this? Maybe we can optimize that. Those were the elements that would have been discussed. That not only is not top anymore, it's not even in the top five. It's moved up being, and I think that's my next point. No, it's not. With everything in between being finance related. So you've got what is it? FinOps adoption, which is kind of establishing a FinOps culture within your business, like maximizing your return on investment. That's the focus. Forecasting spend was up there as well as allocating spend as well. So getting that visibility to drive the action to improve the ROI. That it's all finance kind of related metrics that are driving a lot of this. So really does reflect that shift in the overall piece. The survey also covers, it kind of double clicks on some of the areas, and one of them showed that there's heavy optimization within mainly compute. This makes a lot of sense because compute is where for the majority of companies, it's where the majority of the spend is. So you'll obviously go after the most spend first because the lowest hanging fruit is there. Compute also has the most mature committed committed discounts in place. So for example, in AWS, you've got standard RIs, convertible RIs, spot instances, savings plans of varying different flavors. So you do have a lot more tools in your tool belt to optimize that. But what it does mean is that maybe if you're focusing wholly on compute, there's an opportunity to grab some of that low hanging fruit from some of your other services that you're using. For example, storage is a big one. So if you move from G2 to G3, that is a big saving. I think there's G4 now as well. Your managed services, so like your RDS, OpenSearch, Elasticache, Redshift on AWS as an example, there's similar managed services in the other cloud providers. There's an opportunity maybe there to double click and kind of push some of the optimization efforts there also to go after that low hanging fruit, because it's like the Pareto principle of the 80-20 rule. So 20% of the effort to get 80% of the result. So maybe you've already got your 80% of your result in the compute and you're killing yourself trying to get that last 20%. Whereas if you just took some of that effort and maybe you get that low hanging fruit from the other ones, and that might be something that's seen as an opportunity set across the discipline. Forecasting improvements was another big one that was referenced, and I suppose a lot of this is driven from the the finance folk maybe trying to understand it even from within your own organization, within your business units, trying to be able to compare BUs and teams by having a single metric would be ideal. It's the holy grail to get to a point of unit economics where you can say it costs us X amount to support 1 million customers, for example. Then you can distinguish what is a revenue driving number. So your unit economics piece, so that number, you don't mind seeing that cloud spend go up because it's linked to your revenue. So as your spend goes up, your revenue goes up and everyone's happy and you're making your margin. But then it's all that other spend that's there that you need to kind of find a home for. Is it a dev effort? Is it something else that's kind of starting to creep up that you need to put matters on? So it's just having that forecasting element in there will help. And the more you forecast, the better you get at it. It'll also help with your commitments. So if you're making a commitment to one of the big cloud providers, by being able to have your numbers more solid, you can push that commitment more and get a higher discount without running the risk of you overshooting the runway and getting caught for being under committed and not hitting your number. Next was around AI costs. And this was quite interesting in terms of the fact that it impacts the large organizations more, with 45% of them saying that it will impact, which if you think about it logically, it makes a lot of sense, because if you're a bigger business, the economies of scale and the benefits of leveraging AI come to you sooner than if you're a smaller business and you're kind of doing all things to all people. Being able to spin up a team to focus on an AI initiative mightn't be top of your list. You might wait for some of the more usable tools and services to kind of break out and catch that in the second wave. So that was an interesting piece. AI is always going to be of interest to a lot of people. You're speaking to someone at a dinner party or at a bar or whatever, and you say you work in tech or you want to work in tech, AI is probably going to be something that you end up chatting about. So I'll put the link to this session to the priorities to the survey in the notes. I'll also put in the link to the full summit, which was on YouTube, so that'll be in the notes as well. So you can just kind of follow that, and you can get your own take on what was discussed. Next up, so we started in FinOps, now it's the next layer. So this is the FinOps guys. So they have a What's New in Cloud FinOps podcast that they release monthly. So the two lads are a lot more technically gifted and have a much better knowledge of the cloud than myself. So what I've done is I've just done a summary of what I understood from a base layer of understanding of what they covered. When you listen to the podcast as well, it's broken down. It's quite good. They break it down by service. So they look at, for example, compute, and they cover the three main cloud providers. Which is quite a good way of looking at it, because then you can kind of compare the three cloud providers for a specific thing if there has been any releases. So I do like that. So without further ado, first up was AWS. So the main things that I took from it were around visibility and billing. So the AWS billing conductor is their kind of interface for running some of their billing. And what you can do now is you can assign charges at an account level and an account basis. So if you're a managed service provider, for example, and you want to apply a discount to some accounts that you're managing, that is easier to do now, which will help from a reporting and a chargeback perspective. So that was quite interesting. The AWS have also implemented some price protection limits for spot instances. So what this means is a spot instance is a temporary instance that effectively it's a machine that AWS is going spare, so they'll give it to you for a discount. However, a couple of months back, because there was such a demand for these spot instances, the price spiked massively. So what this does is it allows you to put parameters in place that you'll only move on to a spot instance, your workload, and I say your workload, like someone smarter than me, like as someone technical who's building the application, their workload will move on to a spot instance. But if, for example, the spot instance is really expensive and outside the parameters, it won't move. So it just puts those guardrails in place to stop you, to make it worth your while to move to spot instance in effect. What AWS have also done is they've reduced the listing fees for the marketplace private offers. What does that mean? So oftentimes when you sign up to a multi-year commitment with one of the big cloud providers, you pick a number, and it could be over 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, 10 years that you're going to hit. You're going to spend this number with them. However, if you're a kick-ass FinOps team, or if your engineers and yourselves are working hand in glove, or maybe even if some applications go away or whatever it is, and you're not going to hit that number from your base cloud usage, you need to make it up another way. And one of those ways is by purchasing software through their marketplace instead of just buying it from the vendor. So, for example, if you had an ERP system, you could buy that from the provider, or you could buy it from a cloud provider marketplace. And that spend that you spend on the marketplace will count towards your commit with the cloud provider. The reason that the list price dropping matters is if in the past you've been short on your commitment and you've gone to your software provider saying, here, can we buy it through the marketplace, please, because I'm shy on my commit? They might have said no because it's not really worth my while. I don't think the cut is very material, but like in the dollars are dollars at the end of the day. But now that that fee is lower, it may mean that the software provider is more willing to go through the marketplace than they were before. And as you are speaking to them, if this is something you are going for, maybe it's worth pointing out the fact that the list price has changed. So it might get them more on side and allow them to go through that. Like there is effort involved on your side as well, because instead of going through the traditional procurement methodology, you buy through the cloud provider and you have different checks and balances that you need to put in place. So there's a bit to be figured out there, but it's just something to be aware of. In terms of GCP, or I think they're called GC now, Google Cloud, they've dropped the P for some reason. They made some changes to their visibility and billing, where they're bringing some of it in line with the focus, which is the FinOps costs and usage standard. I think I'll have to double check that acronym, but basically it's a initiative being driven by the FinOps Foundation to try and standardize how the cloud providers provide the billing data, so that instead of it being entirely different metrics and reports and you're trying to do a comparison across the piece, trying to bring some level of standardization so that you can compare apples to apples. So that's something that's in the works, and it's great to see that GC is now implementing that focus framework piece. What GC have also done is their subscription IDs are now included at the billing data, and this will allow you to apply your CUDs, which are your committed use discounts, to accounts better for chargeback information. GC isn't something I spend a lot of time with, but I'm shocked that this wasn't in there before, because otherwise you have to apply a blanket discount across your billing that goes out. It's a lot trickier. Whereas if you can apply it on a subscription level, it's a lot simpler. It makes more sense. In terms of Azure, there was nothing really of note there that I can make sense of anyways. But the guys did mention as well that January was quite a quiet month, so maybe next time around there might be a bit more to discuss. Next up, the Cloudcast. So these lads, I find them really interesting. They release an episode every Wednesday and Sunday. The Wednesday show is generally a interview and it might be a bit more technical. The Sunday show, they call it a Sunday perspective. It's a bit more high level. I myself definitely can understand a lot more of what's discussed on the Sunday than I can on the Wednesday. So it's where if you are starting off, it's worth starting with a Sunday one rather than being scared off with a Wednesday one. But what they've started doing is doing a cloud news of the month. So what I'll do is I'll kind of hit on some of the points that kind of resonated with me a small bit. The first was around the employer dynamic shift. So on LinkedIn and all these sort of stuff, you'll start to see an element of return to office, maybe some layoffs starting to appear. That's reflecting this shift in power as employers are trying to just kind of rein it in a small bit potentially, and you can see the rationale for the return to office. Like if you're a new person starting out on your career, it's a lot easier just to kind of meet someone at a coffee stand and ask them a question with something you're stuck on. Whereas like setting up a virtual meeting is a bit more hassle. It's a bit more of a barrier. So you can, and even from a team building, bonding kind of perspective, there is good rationale behind it, but just something to be mindful of. That if you start moving into FinOps and the cloud and tech, and you're like, geez, sure, everyone's been laid off and everyone's been told go back to the office. I thought this was easy street or whatever it is. Just be aware of that's out there. Another thing they touch on is the VMware and Broadcom acquisition. So VMware is one of my old companies, and what they do in effect is VM stands for virtual machine. So VMware invented the virtual machine, which is basically allows you to slice a physical server to run more than one workload. So it drives massive efficiencies, and it's a legacy technology business with some new innovation as well. That a lot of your on-prem, your private cloud, will probably be running some element, some or a lot of VMware software. So what has happened since the acquisition, the big headline is that Broadcom has done away with perpetual licenses and they've implemented subscription licenses, which mean you pay for it on a subscription basis. And depending on what your licensing was like beforehand, this may have a cost impact. Therefore, some people might be looking at their cloud environment and they're split between public and private cloud, and looking at that balance. Maybe this could be one of the drivers of it potentially. So that's the reason that this matters to someone in FinOps and in the cloud. The next one is around cloud repatriation, and I kind of speak about this a bit at the end as well. I've got a slightly different take on some of the stuff. But what is mentioned here is that there are some articles going around about companies starting to move their workloads from the public cloud back to the private cloud. And this could be for a number of different reasons. And the guys actually make a really good point on it, saying that a lot of the if you're a new business starting out, especially new technology business, it doesn't make a whole pile of sense to buy a whole pile of servers and software for something that may not potentially end up going anywhere. So the cloud is a no-brainer for starting off and for scaling up initially. But perhaps you reach a point of maturity where your workloads and your applications, some of them may be steady state, so they're not showing a lot of variability. The infrastructure and architecture is kind of locked down. Therefore, there may be a case for moving that from the public cloud back to the private cloud because if it's not going to change a lot, potentially you could run it cheaper yourself. Whereas that element of variability you could keep in the public cloud. I think the article that the guys reference is a bit more kind of sensational, where they talk about we've moved a large portion of our public cloud workloads onto private cloud and we saved a bunch of money. I don't have access or haven't seen the data that sits underneath it, but I don't think it's as straightforward as that. Like if you're still using the same amount of workloads, the it's like when you switch something off, you have to switch something else on. There is a trade off there, and I just wonder um, about some of the speak around the repatriation piece. It is something that we are seeing more of because maybe people rushed into the cloud, and you'll hear this term lift and shift. So you basically take all your applications that sat in your own data center and you move it onto the public cloud. Well, the public cloud is really expensive to run inefficiencies. So any inefficiencies that you had in your own data center that you just moved to the public cloud, that will cost you. And maybe because the observability is so much better in the public cloud, maybe you start to see it's kind of like when the lights come on at the end of a night in a nightclub. You really see what you're left with then because the covers are kind of pulled back and you see what's going on there. So that's kind of something to be mindful of as well. But a really interesting take, and even the whole discussion is quite good. What they also do is they do a really good round of AI updates because there's so many updates on AI. It's like where do I even begin? But they do a really good job of kind of simplifying it and kind of bring up the main headlines. What I took from it, my interpretation, there was one around Meta have a AI large language model Llama, which is built in kind of an open source model where you can just kind of plug in and start using it. I think it works in terms of if you reach a certain size of users or usability, or if you're pulling so much from it, then they start to charge. But it's kind of an interesting way that that is being developed. They talk a little bit about the Azure, which is Microsoft, is building in-house models. So Microsoft, as you may know, have a large investment in OpenAI and ChatGPT, which I'm sure everybody's heard of. And what Azure is doing is they're building some smaller in-house models that have fewer parameters, which my understanding of is it takes in less data and it spit like your focus is more narrow as opposed to being all the internet and you can ask me anything. It's you've got a specific kind of focus, which makes sense in terms of future models being more sustainable and bespoke. So that's kind of an interesting piece. As well, they talk about GC partnering with Hugging Face, which is in effect a repository of AI models. So it means that the integration between if you're using a model on Hugging Face, you can plug that into GC or Google Cloud quite easy, which is pretty cool partnership kind of element as well. Um, they also talk about GPUs. So a GPU is a graphics processing unit, which historically would have been used for gaming. But now that parallel processing that those machines do is what's used to drive AI models. So there's a bit of an arms race going on. And the hyperscalers, which are your big cloud providers, are kind of buying them all up just to have them for the future usage that's going to come up down the track. Most of them will be bought by a company called Nvidia. The machine types tend to be a H100 and an A100. I don't know what they look like. I don't know how much they cost. Um, but if you want to sound smart at a dinner party, it's maybe something to throw out there and have a little think about it. But it's kind of interesting the fact that this new technology is coming. The big players are sucking up a lot of that stuff, and maybe it's not all being utilized, so there might be an element of waste, but they they kind of need to be prepared for if this thing blows up that they have them. As they say, better to be looking at it than looking for it. But it's an interesting take. I've put a link to in the notes explaining the difference between a CPU, which is the traditional brain of a computer, and a GPU, which is these new AI things. So when I was doing a bit of research for this, I kind of needed to get it straight in my head, and I found this article helped. I'll also link to the episode that I pulled this from. Same with the FinOps guys episode as well. I'll put the link in for them. Then I have my bonus bits. So this is kind of my what I kind of have seen around from different resources. One of them was around funding AI with cloud credits. So this was something I heard on the Cloudcast, and this was really interesting because it spoke about the investment that AWS is making in Anthropic and Microsoft is making in OpenAI, that there's a mix of cash. Because when I hear investment, I just think they've given them a bundle of money for a stake in their company, kind of like Dragon's Den or Shark Tank. But it's not as straightforward as that. They're giving them some cash. By some cash, I mean like $500 million or something, but they're giving them some cloud credits as well, which is here is some credits to spend on our services in the future as you need them. So when I was kind of backing up thinking about this, I was like, are they effectively guaranteeing their sales pipeline from these AI companies for the next however long until they burn through that cash? Because as an accountant, looking at this from a bare bones balance sheet and profit and loss, they kind of have an asset on their balance sheet, these cloud credits, or for prepayment or whatever. And as they use that, they will recognize the expense, but there's no cash leaves their business. And the cloud provider on their side, they recognize it as a accrual or whatever it is on their balance sheet. And as that cloud credit gets used, it gets recognized as a sale on their books. And maybe I'm completely missing something in terms of how the accounting works, but from a 10,000 foot in the air perspective, that's what it kind of looked like to me, and I thought that was a really interesting thing to think about. Yeah, you don't want to be stuck next to me on a train if that's what interesting stuff I think about. But that was I found that quite unusual. The other thing was around cloud repatriation as an accounting exercise. So that article, I'd seen that article that the cloud cast guys mentioned, and I was thinking about how the public cloud, when you spend in the public cloud, it comes through as OpEx. So it sits in your P&L and it impacts your EBITDA. And I've lost half the room there because so EBITDA is earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization. So that's how a business is valued a lot of the time if you're being sold. So your OpEx is impacting your EBITDA. However, if you're invested in the private cloud, so if you've got your own data center or whatever it is, you make a capital investment. So it sits in your balance sheet. So you buy the servers and you buy the data center. It costs you cash or whatever it is or loan and sits in your P&L. But then it sits in your balance sheet and it hits your P&L as depreciation, which is below if I was a bit shady and I was selling a company, would I, and I had a public 50-50 public and private cloud infrastructure, would I not just move my public cloud onto my private cloud so that my EBITDA looks better because I don't have that 50% of my cloud costs affecting it because it's in capex in the balance sheet and hitting below the line in terms of my EBITDA number, and then it comes to valuation and I get a multiple of my EBITDA. That might just be me being really skeptical, but I just thought it was kind of a different take on the stuff that was out there. That's all I had. I know it was a lot. I went a bit longer than I usually did. Let me know if this is of any use. Also, let me know is there any different resources that you listen to or touch on to get familiar with what's going on in the cloud and technology space. I'd love to hear about them. So that'd be great. Thanks so much. Take care. Good luck. Bye bye.